Hey everyone, welcome to another Wednesday morning tea time tutorial. My name is Brian Robinson, and as always I'm here representing Code Contemporary and our mission to teach the basics of CSS. As you can see from the title, this is, I called it, CSS grid versus Flexbox versus floats versus positioning. It's really all of CSS layout. And I'm going to take a second to go back to a presentation I used to give called Postmodern CSS and talk a little bit about that because I think it's important to think about the past when talking about the future of layout. And really some of the biggest changes in CSS have been around layout. So before we dive into that, I want to make sure that if you do have any questions, you go ahead and put them over there in our comment box so that I can get to them when they come in. There is a buffer to the stream, so I want to make sure that as you ask questions, I get to them as quickly as possible to make sure that they make the most sense to the stream. But we're going to probably not talk a lot about concrete code examples today. There will probably be maybe some snippets later on depending on if there's time and interest, but this is really more of kind of a philosophical chat about what it actually means to be doing layout in this kind of new era. And so I talk a lot about the era, and I like to consider it the postmodern era of the web. And I know that a lot of people don't have a degree in philosophy like I have, so you might be saying, wait, postmodern, like a postmodern is like Andy Warhol? And to that, I would say, kinda. There are actually two definitions I like to talk about when I talk about postmodernism as it relates to the world that we live in today. And the very first is from a French philosopher named Jean-Francois Lyotard. And he said that simplifying postmodernism to the extreme, it is an incredulity to meta-narratives. And a meta-narrative is something like the hero's journey, right? The various myths that we tell ourselves that all our stories are related to from the past. We'll get into what that means for web design here in a minute, but that's one definition, right? It is an incredulity towards those narratives, towards the idea that there even are these meta-narratives. And then the other one is a guy named, and I'm going to butcher this name probably, Miguel Sejuco. He's another postmodern philosopher, and he said that postmodernism was a reaction to modernism. So whereas modernism was all about the objectivity of life and the fact that you could find these kind of absolute truths in the world and in art, postmodernism was really kind of a knee-jerk reaction to that, and it was all about subjectivity. Whereas modernism sought to find that singular truth. Postmodernism was really all about the multiplicity of truths, right? Everyone kind of had, everyone brings their own ideas into the world, and you can't view the world without that kind of subjectivity in mind. So why do I say that we are now entering a postmodern era for the web and specifically for CSS? I like to kind of go through what I view as the eras of the web. And to start, I've labeled prehistory really the basics of the internet as a whole, right? We had point-to-point communications, we had bulletin boards. It was mainly made up of researchers. And it was just a way of communication. It was just very, very light communication. But then we moved into kind of a classical era, right? Sir Tim Berners-Lee came out. He created HTTP. He created HTML. He created the world's first web browser, which just celebrated its 30th anniversary in the beginning part of this year, where the W3C and CERN remade that browser inside of modern browsers. So yeah, this was the very basics, right? It was just documents on a screen. Not a whole lot of stuff happening there. Not a lot of layout happening back then. And then I like to talk about when CSS came on the scene, it kind of initiated the Middle Ages, right? It was kind of a dark time. This was browser wars. This was Netscape versus Internet Explorer. This was all of the things that we associate with the mid-90s and late 90s and all the problems that went along with it. I like to consider it the rise and fall of CSS. CSS came on the scene. It gave us a lot of new power, and with that power came some really horrific things. And it also kind of was this war between table-based layout versus new floats and that sort of layout mechanism that came out in the late 90s. And then we kind of got past that and we found ourselves in a very modern era. This is really where the web took off as a commercial enterprise. This is where things became very, very stable. So this is where we got our HTML5, we got CSS3 coming out, we got some more and more advanced JS, and this was also the rise of the framework, right? So coming out of that dark era, the Middle Ages of our web development, there were a lot of complaints about dealing with cross-browser issues, again, kind of stemming from the browser wars and the fact that some implemented their own versions of the specification as opposed to trying to keep to the specifications very, very closely. Floats function very differently across a lot of different browsers. Floats were the main UI layout mechanism that came out of the end of the dark era, the Middle Ages. And so the frameworks all came out to solve CSS layout when all we had were floats, when floats were the main mechanism for laying out on the web. Nothing against frameworks. For a long time, I used a lot of these frameworks. I've played with Bootstrap. I used Foundation's grid pretty extensively back in the day, as well as rolling my own custom frameworks for various projects as well. So this was really a way of having cross-browser compatibility baked directly in to your CSS. So you never had to think about your layouts and all of the weird bugs and oddities that came out with it. But that really isn't enough when we're talking about layout and design. We want to do bigger and better things. And so we're entering an era of post-modernity, right? We're able to do bigger, bolder, more advanced layouts, and we're seeing with all the new things coming out in CSS, we can do some pretty wild things. So if postmodernism was this reaction to modernism and objectivity versus subjectivity, what does that actually mean for web development, web design as a whole? So I view our objectivism in a couple ways. So first and foremost, hey, look, it's every Bootstrap website ever, right? So we scroll down, there's a grid of 4 icons, there's another subgrid, lots of stripes on the page. This is how a lot of our websites look nowadays. Even coming into this postmodern era, this is the easy way of doing it because it is simple. You get to use Bootstrap, you get to just put some classes on the page and be done with it. So yeah, this is kind of where we've landed from modernism, and so this is going to be one of the objective truths that we fight against. Hey Joe, hey Trey. Let's see, quick question from Trey. What would you say would be the best UX layout for e-commerce section category page that has a bunch of matching products? I'm going to probably need a little more info than that, but I would say data density is going to be one of your best friends in terms of doing anything in e-commerce. So whatever gets us kind of the most data dense, usable interface is going to be the best, but I don't really understand the idea of matching products. And hi Joe, hi to you as well. And then what is kind of our meta narrative of CSS on the web? And our meta narrative is CSS sucks, says every developer ever, right? It is this gif of Peter Griffin trying to adjust CSS in the form of this this lovely set of blinds, and really what he ends up doing is just crashing it to the ground. And that's because it really did become this fiddly little specification, right? Floats were really, really... Oh, hey Oscar, how's it going? So yeah, it became this very hard to manage thing. And so let's talk a little bit about why that is. Let me get back into focus on this browser. There we go. So the rise and fall of CSS, right? The dark ages of of how this was. Let's talk about the history a little bit of how the battle over style sheets came about. And there's a little bit of a timeline that's going to happen. It started out really, really strong. It was a CSS became the winner of the style sheet specification war. There were a lot of other competing specifications for it, but really the cascade, the C part of cascading style sheets, is really what broke the logjam and made it kind of become the go-to specification for styling on the web. It didn't hurt that that Netscape also adopted it, but yeah, it basically, that cascade, the ability for a user agent style sheet to override a website style sheet, was a big part of why people thought CSS was the way to go. It actually is still kind of an underlying architectural thought piece. If you have a plugin in Chrome that you want to override styles on a page, CSS and the cascade is what allows you to do that. Without the cascade, it would be much, much harder to deal with. So anyway, 1994 CSS 1 is written, and this is mainly colors. It's mainly specifying some fonts and sizes and stuff like that. It's all kind of moving away from those HTML, hey, welcome from the north, or welcome from the south, I suppose. Welcome to the north. And so yeah, so the CSS1 specification is complete and goes into candidate recommendation in 1996, and IE3 kind of almost adopts it and gives us some of that power. But again, tables are still our main layout mechanism. And in fact, if you think about it, in 2000 with IE5 on the Mac, that's when we got our first 99% adoption of CSS1. So the very first specification wasn't adopted until 6 years after the spec was written. And so the middle part wasn't quite as strong, right? So in 1998, so 2 years, 2 years after the first spec is complete, we get our first working draft of the CSS2 specification. And then in 2000, it became a candidate recommendation. And then between 2000 and 2007, we saw back and forth in the specification community going from a lot of different issues that came up in writing the specification. And this brought us things like floats, display block, display inline. It also brought with it all of what we rebelled against in that modernity era, right? And so because of this back and forth, browsers implemented very incomplete versions of a lot of this stuff because they were trying to get these in. And so you can see it started in 1998 and it finished in 2011 with CSS 2.1, right? And that's really what we think of when we think of CSS2. It is this kind of secondary iteration on CSS2. And so it was finally published then, but because of all that back and forth, the browser implementations of a lot of these specifications weren't great. And that's really where we get that Peter Griffin pulling on the blinds thought process, because IE5, IE6, IE7 were so much different than back then. So it would have been Navigator and then Firefox. They were like working in two different environments. And so it was really, really annoying. And I can understand a lot of developers moving all of what they had over to frameworks when frameworks came around. So why is CSS3 so much better? And the secret sauce, spoiler alert, is the fact that it's built out of modules and it's not built as one big specification. In fact, there probably won't be a CSS4, and there's actually a great video, and I'll try to find it and post it in the description down below or as a comment, that is Jen Simmons talking about why there will be no CSS4. And it's this idea of modules, this idea that each of our areas of CSS can be broken up and have standards released individually as opposed to waiting for one big chunk to be released, that allows us to move CSS much, much faster. In fact, CSS grid layout, CSS flex are individual modules inside of CSS, meaning that we can very easily move one forward without having to wait on the other. And that allows browser manufacturers to move much, much quicker on all of that. I'm going to pause for a second and take a sip of tea, let the stream catch up. If you have any questions about the history of CSS, now is kind of the time to ask them. I'm going to move on to talking about the layout mechanisms, and it's going to go back to my face again, and I apologize for that. But we're going to talk about all the different layout mechanisms that we have nowadays and which one is going to be used for which implementation of your design. Oscar, great question. So Oscar asks, what's next after Grid and Flexbox for CSS? I am not currently in those discussions, obviously, but I would love to be. But the big thing, I think, is actually refining those. So CSS Grid Level 1, right, the module version 1, just released 2 years ago as a recommendation, and was just implemented in the browsers 2 years ago. They are making advancements in grid layout as we speak. In fact, Rachel Andrew just this week in Smashing Conf in San Francisco gave a presentation about grid layout version 2. And the big thing that's coming in version 2 is this idea of subgrid. And that's a topic maybe for another time. It's not implemented anywhere, so it's hard for me to show you. But it's this idea of expanding layout in CSS beyond even where we're at, but probably baking it in with this idea of grid, flex, floats, positioning to allow for old sites to work great and new sites to have more and more powerful functionality. So I've given a little history. We're going to go back to my face. And I think the important thing to think about at this point is these 4 mechanisms, right? And I'm ignoring CSS multi-column a little bit, and I shouldn't because I actually love it quite a bit. But those 4 things I mentioned, grid, flex, floats, and positioning, really are the tools that you have in your tool chest to be able to build almost any website design that you need. And so I think it's a matter of figuring out when to use each. And I'm going to start by talking about floats a little bit. So I mentioned the dark ages, right? That middle time of CSS2, CSS 2.1. Floats became our main layout mechanism. Floats were never, ever, 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 ever intended to be as big a layout mechanism as they became on the web. And really that amounts to the fact that all of a sudden we had this idea that we could do layout on the web. We could move outside of tables, and really designers grasped on to what they could do with that. So really what floats have always meant to be is you take a media object, an object of any sort, an image, a video, maybe even just a text box and a side in an article, and you wrap text around it, right? So you say float left, the height technically disappears of that, and the text automatically wraps around it. It is only meant to do that. Everything else that floats have done in the history of web design has been a hack to make layouts make more sense. And those hacks are exactly why Flex and Grid were created. And Flex and Grid were literally brought out of web designers want to do X, Y, and Z. How can we make that actually a first-class citizen in CSS? And so the first main thing that floats were being used to do outside of what they were intended to do is this idea of maybe like a 3-column grid, right? You've got 3 promotional spaces and you put them next to each other. Let me open up a new... I've actually got an example that I can pull up in a second. But basically, you put 3 boxes next to each other on a page. You put promos inside those boxes. And floats work to do that. But you have to know the bugs that will introduce to kind of get you around that. Let me see if I've got an easy example to pull up real fast. Shapes. Nope. So not easily, but basically one of the big things that comes out of floating 3 things next to each other left and having those things be side by side is that technically inside the browser, those have a height of 0. The heights collapse, and that's because that's how we allow for that text to pop up next to it. So we can do that, but it's always kind of been this hackish way of doing it. If you have a background behind it, the background collapses because you've got no more heights. You have to introduce a clear fix after that. So you either put a div at the end of it or use an after element that clears both left and right, and that automatically gives the height back to the parent element. The parent element would get its height back. So putting three things side by side, you had to hack things to make that work with floats. And so Flex, which is the first new layout mechanism that came into browsers, aimed to fix that. So all Flex does is it gives you that ability to put things side by side and gives you a really great way of laying out their widths dynamically. So floats, you'd size them, right? You'd size them based on a percentage or based on a firm width, and then they would stack when you broke into that size. Flex automatically sizes those. So our first distinction, right? Floats versus Flex. Floats, you use only to wrap text around an object, right? As soon as you want to lay things out side by side, you move directly into Flexbox. And Flexbox gives you the ability to do that. It also gives you the ability not to worry about margins as much anymore, because we also have what's now called the box alignment module, which is a new module in CSS. It used to be a part of the Flexbox specification, but they broke it out because it's also used in CSS Grid. So instead of putting a margin after your first, a margin after your second, and then clearing that margin for your third, you can actually specify what you want the extra white space to be inside of Flex objects. And so Flex is great for two big things: getting things side by side and then sizing each of those objects based on its content. So as soon as you want to apply different sizes and have those sizes be applied to the items inside of your columns instead of letting them be sized by their content, then we move into Grid. And Grid is great for two big things as well. It's great for having your layout control your content. Flex, your content controls your layout. Grid, your layout controls your content. And also for two-dimensional flow. So for having things that cross rows and columns. And that's very, very important in a lot of more modern, or at least postmodern designs. We can do more and more asymmetry, especially vertical asymmetry, that used to be either incredibly hard or next to impossible, or required about 20 lines more code than was necessary. So that's really what that's for. And then we've got positioning, right? You've got this idea of position relative, position absolute, position fixed, position sticky a little bit, although it's pretty buggy still. And that's really used for pushing content around, right? So if you want to have your content start in a spot and then just shift it a little bit, you're going to use position, probably position relative. And if you want to remove an element from the flow of content, from that kind of block level flow that goes down the page, you're going to use position absolute, and that actually removes it from the content of the page. Everything shifts up underneath it, and you put it right back down on top of it, which is handy in a lot of ways, but also comes with its own downside. So that's how you can kind of manipulate the flow a little bit on the page. So I actually kind of want to show off one quick thing. Let me clear search here. I just wrote an article, and it's on my site, brianlrobinson.com. I'll post a link in the description, of this idea of Flex versus Grid, and the fact that they're not really at odds. They're complementary and they do different things. But I did want to say, if you use one of them, you might end up bloating your code a little bit. So let me pull these up, and I'm going to share my screen again. Share screen. And so it's this idea of this asymmetric grid. We have big promo space on the left. We've got kind of a column, two-column space at the top right, and then two small spaces, right? This is actually a really super handy, interesting layout that we can do super easy in Grid. But when we had to do this, and actually I've implemented this on a production site, it gets pretty crazy in Flex. And so here it is. I obviously did a little more styling on the Grid version. This is implemented in Flex, and as you can see here, we have 12 lines of HTML to accomplish this, including, let's see, 1, 2, 3 layers of nested HTML to make this possible. And then we go over to the HTML for the Grid version, and we have 6 lines of HTML, and only that one layer of nesting, which is much better for accessibility. It's much better in a lot of different ways, not just accessibility, speed, performance, but also the ability for you to kind of understand your design later on. Your maintenance of this is much, much easier if you have 6 lines of HTML versus a dozen. And imagine if you had to deal with that multiple times. And then let's look at the CSS real fast. The CSS is that down here we just have some additional like styling pieces, right? Like nothing that's actually affecting the layout. The layout styles are about 30 lines of CSS in grid, and then in the Flex version we're at about 40, and a lot of the lines of CSS in the grid are actually me changing out those styles. So if we removed the individual background images, if we removed this media query right here, we'd be at about half the CSS written. And that's because grid wants to take a layout and flow your content into the layout. Whereas Flex, as soon as you start wanting to do that, it gets more and more complex to actually get that accomplished. And so just to take a quick look at this, and again, there's a blog post with 2 code pens that you can take a look at on my. I sized them based on the FR unit, a fractional unit of white space. And then I use this idea of grid template areas to name my areas and then assign each of the children one of those areas. So my first child in the promos goes into the main area. The main area, as you can see up here, spans 1 column, that first column, which is double the size of the others, and 2 rows. And then the second one spans 2 columns, 1 row, and the third and fourth are both 1 and 1. So we specify all of that, and then we just flow our content, our individual items inside the grid into those spaces. And so it actually is a very, very clean way of writing your CSS so that later on when you come back to it, you can remember exactly what is happening. I have a grid. It is specified to have these 4 spots available to it. I flow my first child into the first one, second into the second, etc. So it's really, really easy, as opposed to in Flex, where I'm having to create 2 columns that are side by side, and then inside of the right hand column I have to then create 2 rows, and then inside of that second row I have to create 2 columns inside that. So I've got nested flex, nested flex, nested flex to accomplish the same thing. It's much more complex. It requires a lot more effort. It also requires some calculation in terms of the sizing. It requires some margins that have to be cleared out, whereas with grid we get the ability to specify a grid gap that automatically adds spacing inside and not outside. So Joe asks, how do I know if I'm using Flex, Grid, or abusing some abomination of the two? The simple answer is, does your design work, and are you going to bash your head against your design 6 months from now? The less short answer is, if you are wanting to specify layout and have your content flow into the layout, you want grid. If you want your content to be sized based on the content, you want Flex. Flex is at its absolute best when you don't specify a width on the children. Flex does its absolute best work when it takes the children of various widths and allows them to be the width they have and dynamically shrink based on those widths to make the most sense at whatever stage. So navigations are amazing for Flex. There's a lot of great use cases for Flex, but the question at hand that you should ask yourself when debating between the two is, does the content control the size, or does the layout control the size? That's the easy way to think about it, is based around the content. The other side, because everything's a little bit trickier, is support, right? You do have to support some older browsers, and by older browsers I mean IE11 and IE10. If you're talking about Flex, obviously, if you care about IE9, you also have to think about the fact that you probably need to fall back to floats as well. But if your support is such that you can do a complex design in grid and then fall back to a simple design for browsers that don't support grid, then I think by all means go with grid for that. But yeah, it's one of those things where if you're worried about support, you also have to take that into account. I love the idea that we can simplify our HTML, so I highly recommend that your website not necessarily look exactly the same in browsers that don't support grid, right? Fall back to something usable, something clean, which, hey, your mobile design is probably pretty usable, pretty clean. Set that in a minimum width or a maximum width area and allow for that to be your fallback design and then grid it up to kind of go forward. But that's another consideration too. And then the great thing about, you say, abomination of the two is these specifications were also meant to play well together. So you can specify your grid to do one piece of macro design, and then if you want the content inside of that grid item to be sized inside of it based on its size, then you can have a flex area inside of it. You can actually specify display grid on a container, right? And then you could have 2 containers or 3 containers inside of that. Each of those could have display grid or display flex set on them to allow for that to be a flex specified area. So you can make all sorts of, as you quote unquote say, abominations, but some of them are actually intended to work that way, which is kind of cool. So yeah, you would know simplistically if you're sizing your content based on your layout or based on the content. And Joe is very chatty today. I love it, Joe. Thank you. So I've been working with Tailwind and using lots of flex classes. I'm starting to not like so many classes in my HTML and prefer the grid example. Yes. So a big thing for me, right? In this grid example specifically, right? The nested HTML is highly problematic on so many different levels, right? Accessibility being one. Anytime our markup is not semantically correct, we're risking accessibility issues. We're not necessarily going to have them, but the more unnecessary markup you have, the more risk you run there. And also from a maintenance perspective, right? You come back to this 6 months down the line, you're gonna have to think to yourself what's happening here. Whereas you come back to the other one, you know you have 4 items, you know they're flowing into a grid, and you're good to go. So I'm a big fan of the simplifying nature of grid. That flies in the face a little bit of some things you might have to do to support grid for older browsers, but it is definitely, as we move forward, 100% how you do any sort of design like this, right? In my mind, in like Photoshop, right, a designer creates this thinking this is not a big deal. In reality, I mean, it's 12 lines of HTML, it's 40-ish lines of CSS. That's not, it takes probably a talented CSS writer 30 minutes to figure this out and get it going. The grid version you can write in 5 minutes. So it's also that sort of perspective. Like it makes it much easier. And the cool thing about this would be you could fall back very easily to stacked promos and just use block styling for your mobile view, but also for a browser that doesn't support grid. So a lot of cool things that can happen there. So we're at about 30 minutes. I'll take any other questions. So go ahead and make sure you're putting them over there in the chat. But while I wait on the stream to catch up for that, I'll shill a couple things. Like I've said the past few weeks, I'm speaking at Revolution Conf in June. I'm doing a workshop on CSS Grid specifically at KCDC in July, Kansas City Developer Conference. I also happen to have a CSS Grid course. So if you're curious about more information on grid specifically, go check out practicalcssgrid.com, which if I go back to just looking at my beautiful face, you can see up there, practicalcssgrid.com. It is 5 practical examples that allow for you to get up and running with all of the new CSS properties around grid, because there are quite a few, in practical ways. They take kind of examples you might see a designer pass to you and really work through that using this new specification. And I say new, it's been in browsers 2 years now, but it definitely feels new because it's only in new browsers. And then also, let me think, what else do I need to talk about? Obviously, if you want to see more content like this, more live streams, I do a weekly live stream Wednesday mornings. And you can hit that subscribe button down below and click the little notification bell that you can see down there, and that will let you know when I go live every week or as I post new videos in the future around that. And then also with the Practical Grid course, I am working on 2 new examples for it, which will be free for anyone who already has the course, as well as putting an entire section in there about how to support old browsers using grid. Once I get those up and running, which is still probably 2 to 3 weeks away, maybe a little bit longer, the price of the course is going up. Everyone who's already in the course is going to get it for free. Everyone else, there's going to be a premium added on top of that because it's going to be another probably 2 to 3 hours of the course. Because I'm going to go back through all 5 of the original examples and support each one of those, as well as support the 2 new examples that I'm going to be posting in there as well. Yeah, I need to be better about the links in the description box before the stream as opposed to thinking about them after and putting them in. But they will be in there after. I might even leave them as a comment. But yeah, that's definitely a good tip, and I gotta keep that in mind. Streaming is still one of those things that isn't always easy part. I also didn't plan on streaming this morning, which is always fun. I thought I'd be down in Mississippi already, and I am not. So y'all get an additional little bit of content from me, and then I get to wake up really early. That's why my tea this morning is not caffeinated. I only had my 1 cup of coffee, and then hopefully I'll sleep at like 8 p.m. tonight so that I can drive at 5 a.m. 3 hours. So mazel tov on that. So it feels like there aren't any additional questions. I want to thank all of y'all for coming out to the stream. Check out my blog, brianlrobinson.com. All my courses are going up at codecontemporary.com. Again, links will be posted in the stream description after, not right now. And then hit that subscribe button. It makes me happy, and it also means you get my content right away. Thanks a lot for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Hopefully everyone who watched shows up next week as well. Catch you later.